Welcome to the Swedish Rumble Show. In this episode, which is the first late night show airing 11:30 GMT or 1:30 AM CET, we cover the daily news, your questions, and correct any inaccuracies in the reporting on Manchester United, football finance, and football law. There's been a really hectic news day today with a lot of reports out there about transfers. But I wonder if the top news of the day don't have to be the report from Martin Ziegler about Chelsea being investigated by the Premier League over payments to secretive offshore companies. This is of course the offence that Chelsea was sanctioned by the UEFA for being ordered to pay a 10 million euros fee earlier in the summer. But as some of you might remember, we posted at Twitter about this and how the UEFA decision only covered the years 2018 and 2019, since any offence that is older than 5 years will be statute barred under the UEFA provisions. But since the Premier League doesn't have a statute bar at all, any time frame that means that any offences can't be tried, the Premier League can still review any breach that has taken place from 2012 to 2017, which is the period that Chelsea reportedly have made these payments to the offshore accounts. What we learned today from Martin Ziegler's article is that at least 6 payments have been identified to offshore companies, and that the payments have run into 7-figure numbers. Some of the offshore companies have been traced to football agents and intermediaries, but sources with knowledge of the case say that it has not been possible to establish who is behind other companies. So why is this such important news? I think it comes down to this. The FFP rules has a big impact on how competitive teams can be. When you cheat these rules, you gain a significant advantage versus other teams. I think this put pressure on the leagues and UEFA to make sure that teams also follow the provisions. These violations has only been noticed because they were self-reported by Chelsea when conducting a due diligence on Chelsea by Todd Bowley before taking over the club. As someone working in this industry, I can only imagine how hard it is for UEFA or the Premier League to actually discover breaches by the clubs like this. It would be hard for police, the Interpol, looking into significant fraud cases to map these kind of payments with all the tools they have at their disposal. UEFA, of course, doesn't even remotely have any kind of authority to conduct those kind of investigations. Hence, I think that when these breaches are discovered, in the rare cases that are discovered, the leagues and UEFA must act. UEFA could only look at the breaches taking place during the last 2 years. But the Premier League can look at the entire time period. And I would be surprised if the Premier League doesn't more or less feel forced to really come down hard on Chelsea for these offences. We don't really have any track record from the Premier League for deciding on punishment for clubs violating the FFP rules, so it's hard to estimate what kind of fine or point deduction or similar Chelsea will get. But if payments under the table to agents of players or to the player's family directly cheating these rules doesn't result in, for example, point deduction or similar, it's hard to see how these rules can have any effect. Then you can just violate them and make payments under the table and so forth. In addition, we have the lawsuit aspect, as we have covered on Twitter a few times. When West Ham signed Tevez and Mascherano. When those two first came to Europe, they signed for West Ham. And a reason West Ham could sign them was that West Ham was fine with buying only a part of the rights to those two players, while the other part of the owner right to the players were held by agents, which is directly illegal according to the Premier League handbook. West Ham managed to get those players and had a big advantage in the end of that Premier League season, and Tevez was directly involved in keeping West Ham up. So West Ham was sued by Sheffield United that were relegated after a relegation battle with West Ham, and the Sheffield United lawsuit was successful, and I think they got damages of around, was it 20 million? I don't remember the exact numbers. But in this situation, you wonder if teams, for example, that would have received higher payments from the Premier League if they finished above Chelsea might not have a lawsuit case against Chelsea for these violations. But that remains to be seen, and it could, of course, take several years before we know more. The second news we will look at today is coming from Chris Wheeler, who is reporting that Maguire has agreed personal terms with West Ham and that it may require a 10 million payoff from Manchester United to make the deal happen. So why would that be the case? Why would we have to pay 10 million to Harry Maguire for him to sign with West Ham? Harry Maguire has 2 years left on his deal. It's a 6-year deal with an additional, a 7th year that is an option for the club. And his yearly wage is approximately 10 million. West Ham would be willing to pay Maguire 5 million per season approximately, which means that Maguire would lose 5 million per year, or 10 million in total, to go to West Ham. Maguire would certainly get a sign-on fee when signing on for West Ham, but I would imagine that his bonuses playing for Manchester United will be a lot higher than they are paying when playing for West Ham. Hence, I think that the 10 million figure reported by Wheeler could be correct. These things can be handled differently. Either West Ham can pay a very high sign-on fee, including the 10 million to Maguire as part of getting him to sign for them, or West Ham can pay a higher transfer fee to us, and Manchester United can pay off this 10 million severance payment to Maguire. And of course, if West Ham pays the money to us, the transfer fee is higher, and the reports on a 30-35 million deal is probably correct. If West Ham is taking on the responsibility to pay 10 million to Maguire, the transfer fee will be lower, more like 20 million. But like we covered in the episode yesterday, there would still be a huge saving for United if we could get 30 million for Maguire, even if we pay 10 million of those directly to him. But like covered in the show yesterday, there would still be a massive saving for Manchester United next season, even if the club have to pay 10 million directly to Maguire, if the transfer fee from West Ham is 30 million. The total savings in that case would be over £15 million next season. Next up, we have a question from FP01. Regarding the debt on the club, would there be any requirements from a new owner to pay off the club's debt within a certain time period if they obtain majority ownership of the club? This is correct, and it's a topic we covered back in March on Twitter. And it's, of course, the 9-2 Foundation have already stated that they would pay off the debt and make the club debt-free. The question is perhaps, how would Ineos handle the debt? And there were many reports stating that people believed Ineos would keep the debt on the club. There has been no reports to that effect. Ineos hasn't made any comments on the subject. But one thing we can be certain of, and is that the current debt will not survive a successful takeover, a Glazers out. That's because all debt agreements include so-called change of control provisions, and it's pretty natural. If you're a bank and lending money to a company, it's of course very important who owns the company and what the plan is for the company. If a drug lord from some Colombia would take over a company, they would perhaps want the money to be paid back immediately. I think we can assume that would be the case, and so hence these loan agreements always include so-called change of control provisions. And in this series of tweets, we cover what that means. We can just take up one here and look more closely at it. The picture quality won't be great, but what it says is that if there is a change of control, the new owners, the club, should send an offer to the bank to prepay the entire unpaid principal amount under the notes in this case. So this basically means that they must offer to pay back everything that have been lent by the club. So the answer to the question is yes, there are provisions like that in Manchester United's loan agreements. In this series of tweets from, I think it was the 6th March, we look into all of them, and they can be found at Twitter. And today's last question comes from my great friend Mr. Munoz. What restrictions are placed on clubs that have been penalized? Do you believe that the UEFA is working retroactively in order to come to the most problematic clubs last? And what Munoz refers to here is, of course, that we have had a series of announcements from UEFA on fines for clubs breaching the FFP rules. I definitely think it's possible that the most problematic will come last. It's very natural. The harder an investigation is and the harder it takes to make a decision, the longer it will take. And we have seen also, I think, that some fairly straightforward decisions like the one against Manchester United came fairly early this summer, and then we had the decisions against Chelsea and so forth. And I would not be surprised if we saw, if we had UEFA still were to release a decision or two on sanctions on teams breaching the FFP requirements. So what are the restrictions? Well, there is a long range of restrictions that can be used by UEFA, but it's standard that if a club breaches the provisions, UEFA will offer them to enter into a settlement agreement. So that agreement will stipulate a fine that isn't very significant, but still a fine for the club, but also include thresholds that the club must meet over the coming 4 seasons. So even if a club commits a very serious breach of the FFP requirements, the first punishment they will get will not be very severe, but then they must follow the settlement agreement. And I think this is a new aspect of the new FFP rules from UEFA, in that clubs that do not get back in line and start complying with the rules after a first breach will receive very serious punishment from UEFA. And I think that it won't take much for a club that breaches these rules more than once, 1 year in a row, to get expelled from the UEFA tournaments. UEFA could also put in place transfer restrictions on how large a squad can be in UEFA tournaments. But these rules are meant to be progressive. So one breach, then you just have to get back in line and you will pay a small fee. But if you then enter into a settlement agreement and you breach those provisions 2-3 years in a row, then this punishment will get very strict. And I think we have seen that. We have seen teams struggle a lot to get back in the fold, so to speak. And in the last topic, we will cover the news reports today that Real Sociedad is looking to loan Donny van de Beek instead of buying him. And we also have the reports earlier this summer that Nottingham would want to loan Dean Henderson rather than pay a transfer fee for him immediately. And this also coincides with reports that PSG have loaned Gonzalo Ramos from Benfica to avoid breaching FFP rules. So how does this work, and how does a loan impact FFP? I think, first of all, we must look at how a loan can be structured in many different ways. You have a loan without obligation or and even an option to buy the player. Some loans have an option for the team to recall the player, some don't. Then we have the loans with a requirement to buy the player. That requirement can be, and that obligation can be unconditional or conditional. And how a loan is treated under the FFP rules differ depending on the type of loan in question. So we can first look at the PSG loan of Gonzalo Ramos. Obviously, PSG want to buy this player. They want to control him and get the right to have him. I think Benfica will, of course, want it to be secure that they will not lose money by loaning out this player. So they will want the conditions for when the transfer will be complete to be fairly strict. So, but should it just be a loan with an obligation to buy without any condition, then it is treated in the eye of FFP as it would have been a transfer. It doesn't matter if you buy a player directly or if you loan the player with an unconditional obligation to buy the player. That is the same, of course, because it has the exact same effects. But what PSG and Benfica have done here is to, I imagine, that they have put in conditions that everyone expect PSG to meet. And in that case, the obligation to buy Gonzalo Ramos and to record him and have the transfer fee impact the FFP calculations will only occur when PSG have completed the transfer. And I think, but you could of course not have conditions that are merely symbolic, like, well, if the sun goes up tomorrow, then you must buy him. Conditions like that would be set aside. But if we loan Donny van de Beek to Real Sociedad or Dean Henderson to Nottingham, I think it would be in the shape of a loan with an obligation to buy if certain conditions occur. In relation to Donny van de Beek, I would imagine it's games played. That's what we saw with Eric Bailly. And in relation to Dean Henderson, I think it would be probably if Nottingham can secure a Premier League spot for next season, because of course financially it's a major difference for Nottingham depending on if they stay up or if they are demoted to the Championship. And in both those cases, we would only be able to credit the income from their transfer fee once it's established that the conditions have been fulfilled. So it's definitely a risk to loan players with an obligation to buy, as long as there are conditions for the obligation to buy. And I don't think really loans that with an unconditional obligation to buy exist, because there is no purpose to have that type of loans. But this is a thread we made on Twitter back in, could it have been in July? You can find us breaking down all the details here. And this was the last topic for today, and I thank you guys for listening. And if you like it, we are very grateful if you will smash a like and subscribe. Thank you.